Good morning, everyone. Everyone hopefully can hear us. So welcome to the Rotageek webinar for today. We're going to have a quick discussion for the next 60 minutes discussing peak without panic. So before we start, quick introduction to myself and then introduce my co-speakers for the day. So I'm Dave Abbott. I'm the Technical Director at TPP Retail. What we do at TPP is make Android apps for the hospitality sector and retail market. So anything which is shelf labeling, electronic shelf edge, promotions, markdown, things like delivery receipts in stock takes and cycle counts. So helping retailers be as efficient as they can in store. And then also look after their Android devices as well. So we offer something called TPP Total Support for security patching, swaps, and all that good stuff. So if you want to find out more, find me on LinkedIn or tppretail.com. And that's what we do day in, day out. Today, we're going to talk about retail and how the change in peak trade has impacted our stores and scheduling. Last month, Retail Week sent out their Talking Shop report for 2026. So focusing on that, we'll have some questions. So let's first off introduce Ellis from Retail Week. Ellis, if you give a brief introduction of who you are and what you're up to.
Hello. Yes, my name's Ellis Hawthorne, so I am the features editor at Retail Week. We are an editorial brand covering the retail industry. So my main job there is to look after all of our long form content. So those are the big features that are tackling some of retail's biggest issues or opportunities across the market, and our huge set pieces that are produced annually. So things like our staff benefits and discount index, the retail staff pay index, future leaders, all of those big reports are under kind of my purview, and we also cover news and events across the industry.
Thank you, Ellis. And secondly, we've got Jason with us as well.
Hey guys, I'm Jason. I head up our customer operations team at Rotageek. So that means basically anything that a customer touches in the company. So whether it's solution consulting, implementation, customer success, support, and training, kind of goes through me and my team. And I've been with Rotageek for over 7 years. And before I joined Rotageek, I worked for Michael Kors, where I was retail ops director running all the tech that was in stores. So iPads, apps, payment devices, all that fun kit in stores.
Amazing. Thank you, Jason. So brief overview of our hour today. So you may have seen on the screen a second ago, there is links to the Retail Week's Talking Shop report in the webinar resources. So feel free to download that if you haven't seen it already. We're going to spend the first bit of time, so approximately 10 minutes, looking at the reality of how multi-peak and the predictability of retail is changing. Moving on to how to be more proactive, using smarter tools to schedule workforces. And then the chunk at the end is looking at technology and AI and how it can support those frontline workers day in, day out. You'll see on your screens there's a question and answer. So if there's any questions for myself or the panel as we go through, feel free to add them into the chat. We'll try to address them as we go and also have some time at the end as well to go from that. So to begin with, that first topic, reality of multi-peak retail and how it's changed. It's an interesting challenge day to day for retailers now, how they schedule their teams, how they know what's coming, how it is different from each area of the country, let's say, focusing on the UK. So I guess first off, going to Jason, when we look at like the retail operations today, what do you hear are the biggest gaps of how work is actually planned and how it plays out in store compared to a few years ago?
Yeah, I guess when it comes to planning and probably budgeting as well, I think a lot of retailers are generalizing a bit. And so they kind of treat an employee as they're doing like a single job in the store. So you might see, I'm a shop assistant, or I'm on the shop floor, or I'm on tills. And actually the reality is there's a lot more happening in the store that they're responsible for. So the traditional stuff of, customer service and stock and returns, manning the tills is stuff we've always done. But the addition of like click and collect, store fulfillment, and then some brands are adding a lot of services into their stores as well, is adding some complexity, I would say, to how they're budgeting and their labor modeling. And because a lot of these things have SLAs, like, when a click and collect order comes in, it needs to be ready in an hour. What's actually happening is the gap between what you had planned to happen maybe last week or 2 or 3 weeks ago when you built the schedule and what is actually happening in the day is changing at a much faster pace than what they're used to, I guess. And probably the good thing about these technologies is, besides the revenue opportunity that they uncover, is they produce a lot of data. So that's good for a technology company like us or for retailers, because you could then use that data to feed into your forecasting, and you're less reliant on instinct. And the good thing for us, I guess, is we can carry a lot of that workload rather than putting it.
So what kind of data inputs are you taking into Rotageek now to assist with that scheduling?
Yeah, so there's a lot of traditional stuff like transaction sales, footfall, units, really anything that's a good proxy for labor demand.
Yeah.
And things that are obviously a lot more nuanced are things like bank holidays, paydays, events, whether they're national or regional or more localized events as well, all really have a big impact in what the forecast is going to be and when you need to staff and when your peaks are, which is really nuanced down to the store level and even intraday at the store level as well.
Yeah, interesting. And Ellis, from your perspective, is that a similar sentiment that frontline workers are facing day in, day out?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the report found that 71% of shop floor workers found that there were really reactive with regards to planning. So they're finding that there's last minute changes, or they feel that they're understaffed or even overstaffed. So that sheer number, 71%, so that would lead you to believe that's more of a structural problem. It's not an occasional one-off. And to add to Jason's point about how complex that is now, I mean, like the example that jumps to mind is, so if you look back even maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, pre-COVID, would an event like a concert be such a retail event in the way that it is now? So if you think about the impact of Oasis touring or Taylor Swift's Eras tour or something, they are now massive retail events in a way that they really weren't before. So there are just so many factors that are changing how changing how many people are coming in stores and when. There's so many complexities to how to predict it.
Yeah, interesting. And then from the report as well, there were some stats. I think we're going to show them in a second. So there were 3 elements that store teams are really struggling with. So keeping shelf stocks, completing back office tasks, and taking sufficient breaks. Do they resonate as well, Ellis, on like how store teams are feeling?
Absolutely. So let's think about what like for a Sainsbury's local store, for example. So the first Sainsbury's local store in the UK would have been in like the late 90s, if you can believe that. It was that long ago. And if you think about what a small convenience location in the 90s would have looked like compared to what it looks like today, with all of the many tasks that shoppers are trying to complete in that store. So something like, if you'd have walked into that store in 1998, you would have probably seen a row of tills that were all mostly manned. There wouldn't have been people, packing for Deliveroo, trying to solve the problems of 7 people at once at a self-checkout with the red lights all blinking, with deliveries coming through at the same time, with fewer workers overall, because of course there's self-checkout, so you won't need so many workers. There's just then you've got, of course, security issues. Lifting is at an all-time high, and lots of shop workers are really impacted by crime and abuse and theft there. And it's just, when you start to paint that picture of how different it is now compared to back then, and how complex it's become, you can really see why that pressure is getting to people, and why they feel they're underprepared or understaffed and genuinely really stressed out.
Yeah, interesting. And then Jason, from that breaks perspective, I guess Rotageek really assists with making sure teams are looked after from that side and making sure the scheduling fits the requirements.
Yeah, so two things. One, from a compliance perspective, making sure that people are scheduled the appropriate breaks is important. But then the timing of those breaks to kind of optimize them throughout the day so that they sit kind of comfortably in the middle of the shift. So when I'm hungry and not an hour after I get in or 50 minutes before I leave for the day, but making sure that's not interrupting your kind of peak trading periods so that you are staffed appropriately during those times, and breaks, which sometimes can be underappreciated for what effect they can have on your staffing optimization. If you have a bunch of people on break during your peak hour, I mean, they might as well have not been there because you're letting the queues get big and people might be walking out of the shop.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess finally from my side, I think interestingly with the keeping shelves stocked, two of the biggest advancements of our Android solution, Retail IQ, in the last 12 months have been around that shelf availability for big retailers. So really identifying how they can use technology in the colleagues' hands to assist them day to day on that shelf replen tasks, whether it's driven from manual gap spotting in store where the teams can see gaps, or actually driven from things that head office thinks should be selling better based on their location as well. So kind of there's really interesting elements of all three of how it can make it more effective for the teams. Go on, Jason. Time for our first poll. So Amy is working the slides behind the scenes. So again, any questions as they come through, please fire them through and we shall get them in. So the first poll, what's the biggest driver of unexpected demand in stores today? So hopefully you should see that poll coming through. We'll give it 1 second. We need some background music, don't we? So if Jason can sing a song for us for 2 seconds, we'll...
I'll spare everyone. Thanks.
Yeah. So the poll tab should be on the right-hand side, I think, on your screens as well. So weather-driven demand is really affecting promotion campaigns from several others as well. I think interesting with the bank holiday coming up as well. So obviously it looks like we're going to a hot bank holiday. Those kind of things are really unpredictable, but actually really affect retailers day in, day out. I think over the last decade or more, I've heard people talk about weather in various trade meetings day in, day out, whether it be footwear, whether it be outdoor barbecues, etc. How much does that kind of factor into automatic scheduling, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, it actually depends a lot on the format of the store. So like if you're a garden center or something, obviously that has a huge impact when you have a beautiful sunny day. And if you drive through versus for hospitality, at least, if you have a drive through versus in-store seating and stuff like that, can have a big impact. Yeah, from an optimization perspective, it does have an effect, and it's something that definitely needs to be kept in mind. I think the one kind of caveat is weather is notoriously really bad to forecast. So while we'd be really good at forecasting, units or transactions or sales, I mean, every day I look at my phone and go, oh, great, it's going to be beautiful. And then I forgot my umbrella, right? So, and also keep in mind that in most retailers, you're building your schedule 2, 3, 4 weeks in the future. And the weather forecast particularly is really hard to predict, like weeks in advance. So it adds an odd level of complexity to scheduling, because when you're 3, 4 weeks out, the forecast that you find on your iPhone is, generally pretty rubbish. And it's only when you get a day or two out where it actually gets relatively, more accurate. And so that's probably one of the biggest complexities in terms of reworks of your schedule, just because of the unpredictability of weather.
And from your side, Ellis, do those polls resonate with what you're hearing from retailers day in, day out, and how they're scheduling the demand?
Absolutely. I mean, we hear about weather constantly. I mean, it's mentioned in results, particularly with fashion retailers would be the first to come to mind about, if we have a really wet spring, that has a huge impact on how many bikinis are being sold and things like that. So weather's enormous. Whether you believe it to be a bit of a cop-out from a results perspective or not, it's definitely got a huge impact on how shoppers behave. The other thing that comes to mind for me, not so much in footfall, but in what shoppers are looking for, is social media. So social media is enormously impactful, and the virality of trends I don't think retailers could have predicted that all of a sudden everyone was going to be buying sweet potatoes just out of nowhere. An essential will be flying off the shelves that they can't stock it fast enough because a recipe will have gone viral, or a video of someone shoving a bit of cheese inside an entire sweet potato and eating it whole has become a huge trend. And then, so it's not only footfall that they're having to sort of forecast and predict, it's whether the feta pasta recipe will go viral or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah,
I mean, you make me incredibly uncool because I haven't heard of this sweet potato trend. So
yeah, the sweet potatoes were. I think we're on to the next thing now. I think it's like putting berries in a tin or something is the new one. But yeah, the sweet potato trend. You've already missed it, Jason. I'm sorry.
Me too, Jason. So maybe we're in the same boat there. I was not aware of that one, apart from sweet potato
Did
fries.
you just have your sweet potato consumption remained the same? And I think you should be proud. You're not swept up by the trends.
Amazing. So then moving on into a bit more deeper dive, I guess, into looking at what the peak of a retailer's scheduling looks like today. So based on the reports, we're kind of saying that actually that peak trade has kind of disappeared. So we're seeing lots of different moments, as we all talked about then, around different peaks that appear in retailers. From your side, is there anything else, Jason, that stands out from what peak trade is defined as nowadays?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the traditional peaks haven't gone away, right? So Christmas and Black Friday and Easter and stuff are still going to be big drivers of foot traffic and sales. And I guess like the difference is those are really well understood. You probably have endless number of meetings about them. They're generally well budgeted and there's lots of history. But I guess there's like the in-between bit that's a little bit harder, right? So these like kind of micro trends and micro peaks. So what I've recently been hearing a lot about is like payday weekends having a much bigger impact on footfall and sales. And I imagine a lot of that's driven by like the cost of living just being top of mind and inflation and, petrol prices and stuff like that. So those payday weekends are just becoming a lot more concentrated in terms of like the quantity of shoppers and how much they're spending. And then the other one that is kind of nuanced as well is half terms and school holidays, because they're not like, the entire UK is on the same, half term schedule. Like every single store can be a little bit different. And I mean, that can have a big impact on, people taking annual leave when they're on annual leave and doing a staycation. Well, what are they doing as a family? They might be going shopping. They're hitting the high street. So these school holidays and half terms are actually having a pretty big impact as well. And, when I talk to some of our customers, they might have, their 5 biggest stores and they all have like 5 wildly different, like mini peaks throughout the year just because of different regions that they're in and stuff like that as well. So I guess it's like peak isn't just a couple moments. There's kind of like dozens of them throughout the year. And a lot of them are driven by more localized events rather than national events.
Interesting. And you kind of referred to a little bit earlier around how store teams have to respond at shorter notice now. So how does Rotageek help them enable that quicker response to peaks that aren't predictable?
Yeah, I mean, we have a feature for gap shifts. So let's say, all of a sudden it wasn't planned to be sunny and now it's, a beautiful day out. And so shoppers are going to be out in full force. We have gap shifts, so you can send those vacant shifts out to not only my team, but maybe nearby teams to see if anybody else wants to pick up an extra shift to cover that sudden peak. We recently, we've been working with some bigger retailers who have really dynamic foot traffic as well. And so one of the things that we've been developing as well is something called retasking. So you're basically protecting the shifts that you have, but when you're in a big box store, what people are doing within the store is quite important. So you can basically click a button, it'll reallocate your entire staff to where that fluctuated demand has moved to. So like on a hot day, it might have been, in the garden center, but now the weather's, gone poor. And then, now everyone's inside. So while protecting the shift, you're actually moving what people are doing to really be adaptive to your forecast and your labor demand changing even within the 4 walls of your shop.
That's interesting. Yeah, remember the early gap feature in Rotageek from when I was a customer back in the day, and it's always quite interesting around where stores were clustered and how teams could then support each other. So it's a great feature from that side.
Yeah, and we've actually done studies. Well, we had a couple of business review meetings lately, and it's funny, you see like some shops are like super sharers, and so they have shifts, and they have, you know, dozens or hundreds of shifts that are actually being picked up at other locations. So they're kind of acting as like a employment hub for other locations nearby, because maybe, you know, they have too many people on annual leave, or maybe you know, they're just not staffed properly, or they have a peak that they weren't planning for. So it's actually used more so now, even outside of my own four walls, into, you know, my area or my region.
Yeah, it's far more collaborative, isn't it? So it's interesting. And then Ellis, from your side, you've kind of talked a little bit about some of those trends. Anything else which is really like shifting that demand in retailers away from those key peak Christmas and Black Friday times?
Yeah, I mean, as Jason mentioned, they're still incredibly important, popular. I think treatonomics has quite a lot to do with it. Again, Jason, you mentioned about pay and that payday weekend. So obviously, I'm sure we're all familiar with the lipstick effect of, you know, in tough economic times, shoppers are looking for kind of little lifts and ways to sort of you know, and boost their mood, that dopamine hit. So those, I think those opportunities are really, really important. Like we see retailers that are able to offer those ways to treat shoppers, ways to treat themselves, are performing really strongly. The other thing is just there are kind of, because of social media, there are cultural moments that are becoming retail moments too. Like the one that jumps to mind as is less reactive example, but sort of if you cast your mind a few years back to the Barbie movie, so that was just a movie like any other movie that was coming out that people were excited about, but it had the ability to transform into a huge retail moment. There was collaborations all over the place, Zara, Primark, pretty much everyone was getting involved with collaborations on that film, and there were things to buy for it. There were outfits to be worn. There were Barbie pink shoes to wear to go to the cinema. So I think having an eye on cultural moments is really important for retailers in order to predict like when these spikes will be. But the issue with social media is there are so many different variations of what a cultural moment will be, and it's really difficult to predict which ones will take off. I remember having the conversation with colleagues about before the stills of Ryan Gosling and Margot Robbie and the roller skates came out and hit Twitter and became huge. We're talking about, do you think we should write about this? This seems like it's probably going to be quite big for retail. There's maybe an opportunity. And it was very much like I don't know, I'm not sure, seems a bit weird, seems a bit strange, a bit niche. And then obviously it was worth millions to retail. It was a huge moment. So I think it's so difficult, but having an eye on those like cross-culture moments is really important now too. They create lots of micro peaks and lots of micro demands for lots of different sectors and categories.
Yeah, so far harder to predict. So I guess moving on to our next stat from the report around how reactive versus proactive workforce planning is changing as well. So I think we've covered some of this a little bit, but actually looking down the bottom, 73% expect stores to become more experience focused. 71% of frontline workers say scheduling is reactive, resulting in last minute changes. So I guess, is there any good example, Jason, from your side around where you've seen labour mismatches with your customers and how Rotageek's assisted changing those?
Yes, like a good example is we talked about like the gap shifts. We've been doing some work with a customer, and they found that 43% of their gap shifts went unfilled, so they were still vacant. And then we were like, well, maybe it's because a lot of people call in sick. And so we dug into the numbers a little bit more, and only 10% of those were due to sickness. So that means 90% of those were actually due to, demand being increased or demand changing. And so they were utilizing the gap feature to send those, shifts out, but getting that uptake of those left a lot of room for improvement. So yeah, that was interesting. And we had another customer who, again, using the gap shifts for filling those vacant shifts. And in some of the regions, they only had a 10% uplift. So I guess like what this draws is like that flexibility is really important. And like these gap shifts are great for, that kind of like true last minute, someone calls in sick, but getting in front of the problem by just doing a better schedule in advance is still like a really important thing that you can't ignore, because you're not always going to have 100% fill rate on these gap shifts, and the knock-on effect is that your store teams are affected, they're stressed out, customer service is falling, queues are longer. So that forward planning is really important still.
Do you get to look at any of the data around like people taking up the gaps? So there's certain types of workers that are quite reactive as well. So like someone is always taking every gap in certain areas, or is it quite evenly spread when people are using gaps?
No, I mean, there's definitely, we talked about like these super share locations. We did some similar analysis on like the people that are taking them. And you'll have people that just really want the wage, they really want the overtime, they really want to pick up those shifts. And maybe they're on a lower contract, or maybe they're in school, so they're only contracted to work maybe 8 hours a week or something. But some of these people are taking a lot of their shifts. So even though when they're advertised not only from my store but nearby stores, there's certain individuals that are just eating them up and taking because they want to increase their own wages, and that's an easy way to do it without the retailer having to hire more people.
Yeah, interesting. And from Ellis, from the kind of frontline teams, how are they feeling with like stores becoming more experience led? Do you get any kind of interesting insights from that side of how the retail environment day to day is shifting more experience focused as well?
I mean, the primary thing we hear from frontline workers is that it's an increasingly difficult job in lots of different ways. I mean, one of the retail, I think, if it is the highest, if not, say it will be second highest or highest for flight risk, which is like frontline workers that are planning to leave within the next year. So I think the pressure on workers is immense. So when you're, if you've got the addition of things not being properly planned out and things not being properly considered, then you're compounding those issues, aren't you? You're adding more pressure if people can't, or if they're constantly feeling they're in a situation where they're not supported. You're not going to get your best out of your workers, and you're going to make a bad situation worse, especially when there's greater emphasis on that those in-store moments and the customer experience. It's like you're setting them up for a really difficult job there to deliver.
Yeah, and it increases the pressure, doesn't it, I guess? So it's interesting how you balance that.
It's a tough one because there are overall fewer people in these stores too. So the pressure is on fewer shoulders, which is so you have to make sure you're really looking after the ones that you've got, because at the moment it doesn't seem like, with that flight risk level, people feel that retail is a long-term career for them, which is a real shame, and it's really the last thing that the industry needs at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about that career, like confidence, interestingly, in retail, isn't it? So it feels like it's shifted a little bit over time.
Yeah, I
because
mean,
of the increased pressure. Do you feel?
yeah. So what's difficult. What's a shame is retail was always seen as like a real bastion of social mobility. So you could come in on the shop floor and you could become the CEO. Like M&S, Stuart Machan's a really like a classic example of that. It started off collecting trolleys from the car park, and now it like is as of today posting results for a £17 billion business. So it's that's the classic. Retail's really associated with that. Is one of the few sectors that happens frequently. When we were at our awards in March, our editor-in-chief asked, so thinking this room is full of directors, full of chief executives of the biggest retailers in the UK. And when they were asked, like my editor asked, did you have a retail Saturday job? Pretty much the entire room shot their hands up and said, yeah, worked. I mean, myself, I had a Saturday job in retail too. It's a great start to the world of work for so many people. And I don't know that the environment at the moment is giving people the faith that A, they want a long-term career in retail, and B, that whether they want to be in the world of work at all, that it's stressing people out, it's causing mental health issues, people are dealing with abuse on the shop floor. The vast majority of people working in retail have been subject to some level of abuse while they're working there, which is just extraordinary. It's something is shifting there. And not necessarily for the better.
It is interesting because, I started on the shop floor as well back in the day, and it's such a formative experience, isn't it, to learn how to deal with customers day in, day out, and that kind of success of how you can progress through it. So I think it is a really strong career path still, but it has to be celebrated for that, doesn't it? Which is interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, and I spoke to, so we do our Future Leaders Report, which is a list of people. Every year we look at it, list of people that are like your CEOs in waiting, the people that have got the potential to go to the top, that are maybe at director level at the moment. If you look at the time and still now, when you look at CEO positions, lots of them lie open for a really, really long time now. And that, when I spoke to headhunters about this, they are telling me there is a total dry talent pool. It is so hard to find UK talent for these positions, so they lie open for a really long time. There's also the question of whether, it's an incredibly public job as well as scrutinised. So I think that, do people want that anymore? Is it worth the money? But, that the number of people that think retail is a long-term career for them is dwindling. And when you look at the circumstances and all the pressures and the understaffing, it's a no-brainer. On top of that, coming into work to be shouted at by customers, it's so tough. So I think it's so important for retailers to make sure they're doing all they can to make sure that the staff they do have feel supported and they aren't miserable and thinking, I can't wait to leave this industry.
Yeah, for sure. So then moving, I guess, on to our third topic for today, kind of the supporting role of technology and AI within retail. 44% of people surveyed said that digital change in stores is driven from the top, and there could be an opportunity for more frontline involvement in it. And 76% would trust AI or intelligent scheduling in some form to manage their rota. So I think myself and Jason have known each other for a long time, and auto scheduling was a thing before AI and ChatGPT. But how's auto scheduling changed at Rotageek over the last few years, Jason?
Yeah, so I think there's been a couple changes. So first one is we're updating the way that we're looking for the optimal schedule. So we're actually launching something called large neighborhood search, which is a totally different way of searching the entire solution space to find what is the best schedule. And I guess the good thing about that is it's a lot faster, because if you think about, when I sit at my computer and I go onto Claude or ChatGPT, I type something in, and that kind of thinking thing, you're like, tapping your fingers, wanting, asking it to hurry up. So people are becoming a lot more impatient, and they just want things immediately. So one of the benefits of the large neighborhood search is it's a lot faster, and you get a much better result. So that's probably one of the biggest changes in terms of how we're investing in the auto scheduling tool. And then that kind of new iteration of it as well, with that retasking that we talked about earlier, of not just optimizing your shifts, but also re-optimizing what people are doing within the shop front. So it's kind of one of the same, but a little bit different in terms of an optimization problem. But you're just looking kind of within my four walls rather than where do I place my shifts. So those are probably the biggest changes we've made in the past, 6 months, I would say.
Interesting. And then Ellis, from your side, interesting findings of how store teams are willing to embrace newer technologies and this automated scheduling idea. What do you think makes frontline workers feel like they can trust it maybe more now than ever from a scheduling perspective?
I think there's two elements to this. It's obviously our, the nation's relationship with AI generally, like our using a chatbot today versus, a few years ago, can be vastly different experiences. So I think we have a greater relationship, or we have more trust in AI anyway as users. I think the other element of it is that the communication element. So I think shop floor workers are more willing to. They're seeing evidence that these things are actually working, and they're being involved. If they're being involved within the conversation of new digital developments, there's been all sorts of new things brought in. They feel like they can be part of that conversation, and if it's going to help them, most people are willing to accept it.
Yeah, interesting. And then the second part there with how frontline workers could be more involved with that technology change, Jason. How do you see that feedback loop working back into teams trying to deliver that change? Do you see good examples of that within your customers?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we tell new customers is to engage, really strong field leadership as early in the process as possible. So some of our customers have even brought in maybe an area manager or a really strong store manager who's maybe for the flagship location, who their feet on the ground, right? They understand how things actually work. So I would say bringing those people in early is always really beneficial, because there's the head office view of how stores operate, and then there's the reality of how they actually operate, which might be the same, might be a little bit different. And most of the time we actually find there is a gap there, and sometimes it's not controversial gaps, but sometimes it's pretty substantial, and it can have an impact on how you might configure the solution or how you might launch the solution. Or if I'm in head office, I might not think ahead about how some of these features will be perceived, or how you might train on them as well. So having those people that are actually in the stores as early in the process as possible, I think, is really beneficial. AI, well, really any tech, I would say, but especially with AI, just because it's so new, and you're going to have people that are completely horrified of it and think it's coming to take my job, and then there's going to be people who live and breathe AI all day long, and so you want to make sure that you're dealing with all ends of the spectrum when it comes to adoption.
I think those years ago champions we used to have for Rotageek would be really interesting way of speeding up that onboarding process for teams that wanted to ask questions but didn't want to ask it directly into the project. And so I've used that several times over my years with different technology projects, but a champion within each location or each geographic location to talk to teams to ease that process, which is really key, isn't it, from that engagement?
A lot of our customers will have super geeks, or they all brand them as something, right? And there might be one per area or one per region who are kind of the go-tos. And they often act as the trainers. So when you're doing the initial deployment, they're super involved in the configuration and have training to the nth degree, because their job is actually going to go to cascade this training down to the end users who are going to be using it every day. So making sure that they're experts and they feel really comfortable is super important to kind of the long-term adoption. Some of our customers, just talking about these trainers and champions or super geeks, is we had a customer who had probably, they quoted and said that it was probably the most successful technology project they've ever done, and it was really, really smooth. But they were like, if there's one thing we would have done differently, is we would have brought in our trainers and given them actually access to the tool way earlier, not before launch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months before, because they really want to make sure that they know how it works, and they can answer the questions. And a lot of times you only learn from using, right, rather than being told. So that's something I definitely try and instruct customers to think about, is how soon they involve these people as well.
Yeah, interesting. And then Ellis, from your side, the report suggests the challenge isn't the resistance to the technology, it's whether the employee feels involved day in, day out. Why is that involvement piece from the frontline worker team so important?
I mean, it's the same whether you work in retail or anywhere. Like, nobody particularly enjoys having decisions made from the top down and handed to you without understanding why you're using them or what the benefit is. I think there are, like, I was surprised at the sort of how well, I think it was like 12% said they were uncomfortable with digital change, which I think is really low. But there was also a stat that, a good chunk of people felt like the tech that had been brought in so far hadn't really helped them. So there is a bit of a gap there. But the communication part is so key. Again, when you have that picture of what a shop floor worker is dealing with, and then you've got people, so what will be many people's perception of it as someone in HQ that doesn't have a clue what goes on the shop floor, gets to work from home, is making these like sweeping decisions that sometimes seem like, when you're involving AI, sometimes seem like monitoring and keeping really close eye on what people are up to on the shop floor. That is a recipe for disaster. So when I've spoken to, I spoke recently to a really huge London department store retailer about a new bit of kit that they've brought in, which is essentially asking shoppers at the till one question, and that can be anything from, did you visit the second floor, or did the person serving you wish you a good morning. So there's elements to that could be, a shop floor worker could see that as a bit of a threat and a bit of pressure on their job. But when I said, well, why, how have you got complete buy-in from your staff? The retail director told me, well, we involved them in every step of it. We showed them the tech. We spoke to store managers and people on the shop floor, showed them how it worked and asked their opinion on it. And when they felt it was a good thing to do, they introduced it. So they were able to manage the introduction of it. There was no surprises. There was clear communication at all times. And then you've got your manager, your line managers able to feed that through onto the shop floor workers, and you just ultimately have a much better time.
Yeah, it's really key of how any technology project lands, isn't it? Of that engagement, because actually it's the tech that's in people's hands day in, day out. Like, if they are not engaged with it, they will just ignore it. It's interesting, you kind of mentioned a minute ago, Jason, around some of the bigger large language models from Claude and ChatGPT. Slightly biased from a TPP perspective, but we worked with Zebra at the Retail Tech Show on their version of an LLM for frontline workers, so called Zebra Companion. And actually the whole goal is that it gets to the answer a lot faster, so you're not waiting for that awkward moment with a customer. But actually some of the clever chip technology that I think lots of the big people will talk about over the next 12 months will mean that some of these small large language models, which is contradicting itself, will run on device. So they'll be able to get even faster responses as well. So we'll start to see some of that appear in store over the next 12 months, I think, with some early adopters from retailer side. And it'll make it far more accessible, because I think there's some that have rolled out various of these solutions to try and improve the speed to competency for frontline workers. But actually, it can be quite awkward if you're stood in front of a customer waiting for a response. I don't know if you've heard that, either of you.
Yeah, I mean, with all this AI tech, I think we're still in like the wild west of exploration, I would say, right? Like, it's like a faux pas to not put AI all over your website, right? So everyone's kind of forced to talk about AI, whether they like it or not. I actually got out of a meeting the other day and we joked that we went an entire 2.5 hours without using the word AI. And so we were like, giving ourselves a round of applause for managing somehow to not use that word. But when it comes back to like the tech, like, I think there is a lot of stuff being tried, and like, you're throwing lots of things at the wall, but some of this stuff is shiny and fun and sounds promising, but some of it isn't necessarily proven at this point. And some of it I find is a little bit hard to quantify the ROI on as well. Like, these novelty kind of robots in stores and some of the surveillance stuff, and some co-pilots in lots of things. Everything has a co-pilot now. So I think it's a really interesting time to see what people try and what sticks around, because you think of stuff like the just walk out technology, and I think a lot of the retailers have kind of abandoned it. It seemed like the coolest thing ever at the time, and then it was like, oh, actually there's no ROI, or it's weird, or I don't know, maybe Ellis knows the reason why they've abandoned it, but there's lots of shiny toys that people feel they need to play with, but I think it'll come out of the wash what actually has an ROI and what was just a fun hobby project that Ops did and then abandoned, a couple of years in. So it's interesting.
I think that's kind of an interesting point, isn't it, Jason? Sometimes you said what Ops did, because actually sometimes it's a tied up project with different departments involved that makes a success of technology rollouts. Whereas if it's just something that's tested and tried, that ROI isn't always defined at the beginning, is it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And then what are you trying to accomplish? And then how do you measure that? And then how do you establish at the start, whether you're piloting or whatever, and then actually measure against it to see if it's actually doing what you thought it was going to do, or maybe it had an adverse effect, or maybe, I guess you don't know until you try, but it's really important to know what you're trying to accomplish, and then making sure you have a way of measuring that throughout the project to make sure that it's actually delivering what you thought.
Yeah, definitely. And Ellis, from your side, anything you're seeing from your chats with retailers, frontline workers, how this adoption's going? Is there adoption out there of AI solutions already?
Oh, absolutely. But I guess one of the things we hear about most is when they go wrong. There's the one that comes to mind is the Morrison's AI, like the tracking. It was almost like surveillance on how quickly shelves were stacked. And the fantastic thing about being in 2026 is if your workers are upset about something, they will make it an enormous problem for you just on the World Wide Web. So they took straight to Reddit, and what was like quite well intentioned was just a massive source of tension. So yeah, I agree with Jason, absolutely. It's like there are a lot of things that are being thrown at the wall at the minute, but which is expected, but the picture is changing so quickly that it's like, you can't really blame retailers for trying new things and testing them out, even if it does end up on Reddit.
Definitely. So then I guess moving into our Q&A session, we've got 10 minutes left. So any questions for the panel or myself, please pop them in. Taking it back to workforce planning, what's the one thing that retailers still underestimate about workforce planning day in, day out, Jason?
I think a lot of times it comes down to thinking of workforce management as like a cost control measure. I think is something that you hear a lot. It's like, oh, I can cut some labor here, and I can shimmy a shift here, or maybe get by without an extra headcount there. And I think it's natural for humans, by the way, to kind of go to the more of a negative approach sometimes. But I think what's actually interesting is thinking about all the revenue you're leaving on the table by poor scheduling, right? So think about the flip side of like, how could you increase the conversion rate? How does your average, spend increase? Yeah. So I think they underestimate like the positive side of it a bit, and they overemphasize at a minimum, right? Like the cost side of it, which is important, obviously, because the FD wants you to save money. But like the flip side is it actually is great technology to help you give better customer service and make more money. It's not something that you should, discount, I would say, when you're doing your analysis and ROI of the tech.
Yeah, interesting. And it's so key, isn't it? Like the P&L of team members in retail is so huge compared to some of the other elements, like the fact it was overlooked for quite a long time, quite a lot of retailers, and scheduled on Excel paper, etc. Now gives them those tools to make sure those experiences in store are the best they possibly can be by having the right staff, the right team members there at the right time.
And with the right skill mix, right? Because with click and collect, I mean, and store to fulfillment, there's a whole new skill mix that you probably never took into account when building that spreadsheet 10 years ago, that you now need to take into account.
No, definitely. And then Ellis, you kind of touched on it a little bit with the Morrison's example, but any early warning signs that leaders should be paying attention to with tech projects? Anything that should be standing out to them of this is a red flag, it might not be going quite as we planned it?
Other than Reddit threads. Yeah, I mean, it'll be from store managers, absolutely. I think you need to make sure that those communication channels are as open as they can be. There are lots of really good examples of staff feedback forums that are so. I feel like I keep mentioning M&S, but there's a really strong M&S one. I think is it Primark that has forward as well, which means that some staff feedback can go immediately to the right people. I think those staff feedback forums are really important to be monitored as well, because you're not only are you going to hear when things aren't working, but there's potentially great ideas from people that are speaking to customers day in, day out. And if they've got the gumption to log on to these things and make use of them, they are likely paying close enough attention that they will know what the real issues are. And they most likely will have ideas and at least some strong kick-off points for how you improve things for staff and for customers. So I think those open lines of communication are so important. And the red flags will fly in from there.
I think the M&S one is straight to Stuart, isn't it? If I remember
That's
correctly.
right.
Feedback loop, and very well done. And then Jason, I guess, what if there's one thing that retailers could focus on as a practical shift tomorrow? What should they start to be thinking about of how they deploy tech in their environments?
How they deploy tech. I would say probably, and it goes back to like employee adoption. I was like focus on like the internal PR and the messaging around it is probably a really big one that we're seeing. Dave, you've worked with Rotageek for a long time. Like, it's called auto scheduling, right? Well, auto scheduling is starting to get like a kind of a bad rap because the auto kind of implies that you're taking the human out of the loop. And so it's funny because almost all the customers that we've launched on like the optimized scheduling solution, they've kind of done their own rebrand and they call it assisted scheduling because they want it to feel like a co-pilot. They want to feel like it's a helper. And so by removing the word auto, how they launch it, internally, it's actually been like one of the biggest like changes that I've probably seen in the past, couple of years. And it's probably driven by AI adoption, right? Like AI is a bit everywhere. People are pretty used to and kind of trust it for ChatGPT and stuff like that. So like how you kind of rebrand it in a more positive way is really important rather than this, the machine is doing the work for you, which might have been more of the approach that we took a couple of years ago, right? So I think it's like internal PR stuff is actually...
It is really interesting how that conversation moved forward, isn't it? Because even like writing AI policies in the last 12 months internally, that human in the loop element of what's going on is really key, isn't it? And talked about a lot more transparently across all these industries now. But yeah, one interesting way of rebranding that to make it a tool, not something that's just been taken out of your hands.
Yeah,
that's interesting. And from yourself, Ellis, any last thoughts on the Retail Week report on how frontline workers is shifting and what the changes that are happening in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I could just give some advice to retailers is just remember you don't exist in a vacuum. Have a look at what your competitors are doing. There are so many fantastic examples out there of new technology that is being implemented and the way it's being done. There are cautionary tales, obviously, as well. But there are genuinely lots of examples of really strong, well implemented new tech. Upped our coverage recently on from the suppliers, so we're spotlighting new suppliers that have been recommended to us by retailers. So I used to get lots of questions of could I recommend anything from photography to different AI systems and chatbots by retailers, and we all got a bit fed up of sending lists of business names and emails. So what we do now is spotlight a tech provider or solutions provider of some kind every week that has been recommended, by a retailer. So we've had Holland & Barrett, Ocado, Morrison's, loads of huge retailers that have said this business has been really transformational. So your problems are not your own. There likely has been another retailer out there that is facing the same thing and is dealing with it in different ways. So have a look and explore out there to see what the solutions are.
Thank you very much. And that brings us pretty much to the end of the hour. So thank you, Jason. Thank you, Ellis, for your input in the last hour and your insight in what's going on. I think the takeaways from obviously what we've discussed, that multi-peak environment of how demand changes rapidly in the store environment is moving forward, how we can be more proactive, it's becoming more aware of what's going on in our local retailers and how they can work to fill those staffing gaps. And also how we engage with that technology in a frontline worker perspective, day in, day out, is going to really be key for changes over the next 12 to 24 months. So if you want to listen back to the session, there will be a replay available, I'm being informed, so you can get it again and listen to us for a second hour, but it'll be the same things, I think. And again, if you want to reach out to any of the team at Rotageek, at Elmo, myself or Ellis, feel free for any further questions. Thank you again for an hour of your time, and we look forward to doing another one of these soon. Thank you very much.